The Baron died with a rattling gasp that echoed through the halls of the great house, but he didn't go out alone. He left behind a secret that was meant to burn the whole plantation to the ground. While his body was still warm, the woman who called herself his wife was already reaching for the keys to the safe. Baroness Eleanor didn't shed a single tear. She was too busy counting the acres she thought she now owned and the debts she desperately needed to pay. But the Baron wasn't a fool. He knew his wife was a snake, and he knew she had been dripping poison into his nightly tonic for months. He couldn't save his own life, but he made sure that when he fell, he'd pull her down into the mud with him. And the man he chose to hold the rope was Silas, a field hand who had spent 50 years being invisible in plain sight. The humidity in Louisiana that morning was thick enough to choke a mule. The moss hung from the cypress trees like gray funeral shrouds, and the only sound was the rhythmic thud of a shovel hitting the dirt behind the slave quarters. Silas stood in the shadow of the back porch, his hands calloused and his heart heavy. He wasn't just mourning a master, he was mourning a promise. 2 years ago, the Baron had sat Silas down in the library and showed him a piece of paper. It was a deed of manumission. It said that upon the Baron's death, Silas was a free man. It was signed, sealed, and kept in a mahogany desk. But as Silas watched Eleanor emerge onto the porch, her eyes sharp and predatory, he knew that paper was as good as ash. Notice this. The world is full of people who think a silk dress can hide a stained soul, but the dirt always finds its way to the surface. Eleanor looked at Silas not as a human being who had served her family for 4 decades, but as a loose thread that needed to be clipped. She didn't offer words of comfort. She didn't even acknowledge his grief. Instead, she held up a single sheet of parchment, the very paper Silas had dreamed of for years, and she held it over a flickering candle. Silas didn't move. He didn't beg. He just watched as the edges curled and blackened, the word freedom disappearing into a cloud of foul-smelling smoke. Eleanor smiled, a thin, cruel line on her pale face. She told him he was a thief. She claimed he had stolen silver from the dining room, a lie meant to ensure he would be sold to the highest bidder before the estate was even settled. But then came the reading of the private instructions. The Baron had left a specific public bequest in his will that Eleanor couldn't ignore without raising the eyebrows of the local solicitors. In front of the gathered workers and the overseer, a man named Caleb who smelled of cheap tobacco and malice, Eleanor had a servant fetch a mouldy, moth-eaten sack from the barn. She tossed it at Silas's feet with a laugh that sounded like dry leaves skittering over a grave. She told the crowd that her husband's mind had gone soft at the end, and as a reward for Silas's loyal service, he was to receive nothing but a bag of common rye grain. The other workers looked away, embarrassed for Silas, while Caleb spat on the ground and laughed. Eleanor told Silas to take his inheritance and get out of her sight, or she'd have him whipped for standing on the porch. Silas picked up the bag. It was heavy, heavier than it should have been for a half-full sack of grain. As he hoisted it onto his shoulder, he felt something hard and cold shift against his collarbone. It wasn't the soft slide of seeds. It was the weight of something solid. He didn't say a word. He walked back toward his cabin, his mind racing. He knew the Baroness was planning to sell the plantation to cover her gambling debts in New Orleans. He knew she needed him gone because he had seen her in the hallway at night, moving toward the Baron's room with that small blue vial. What she didn't know was that the Baron had seen her too. If you've seen enough of this world to know that the loudest voice isn't always the one telling the truth, subscribe. Here we pull back the curtain on the things they tried to bury. And tell me, do you think Silas should have run right then? Or was he right to wait and see what the dead man had truly left him? Back in the dim light of his cabin, Silas bolted the door. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy brass key with a broken tooth. The Baron had pressed it into his hand 3 nights before he died, whispering only one word: the rye. At the time, Silas thought the old man was lost in a fever dream. Now, looking at the sack on his dirt floor, it all started to click. He didn't just pour the grain out. He felt along the seams of the bag. The fabric was rough, but near the bottom the texture changed. There was a false bottom made of hardened, oil-treated leather, stitched so perfectly into the lining that you'd never notice it unless you were looking for it. With a small knife, Silas carefully picked at the threads. His hands were shaking. He knew that if Caleb or the Baroness walked in now, he'd be dead before he could explain himself. As the leather flap came loose, a small package wrapped in black oilcloth fell out. Inside wasn't gold or jewelry. It was a thick, leather-bound journal and a set of legal documents. Silas had learned to read in secret years ago, huddled over discarded newspapers by the light of a tallow candle. He opened the first document, and his breath hitched. It wasn't just a copy of his freedom papers. It was a marriage certificate from 1842 from a parish in New Orleans. But the name on the certificate wasn't the Baron's. It was a man named Julian Vane. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Eleanor was already married when she wed the Baron. She wasn't a widow, she was a bigamist. She had no legal claim to the estate, the land, or the people on it. Every cent she had spent, every order she had given, was based on a lie that could hang her. And there, tucked into the back of the journal, was a detailed account in the Baron's own hand. He had documented the taste of the poison, the dates she had administered it, and the fact that he had hidden the evidence of her first marriage in a place only Silas would find. The Baron had used his final days to set a trap, and Silas was the one who had to spring it. But Silas wasn't safe, not by a long shot. Outside, he heard the heavy boots of Caleb the overseer. Caleb didn't care about wills or justice. He only cared about the gold the Baroness had promised him if he handled Silas. The Baroness was desperate to get that bag back. She didn't know what was in it, but she knew her husband had been too deliberate with that specific gift. She knew the Baron didn't do anything without a reason, and the way Silas had carried that bag, protecting it, not just dragging it, had made her suspicious. Silas looked at the small window of his cabin. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the fields. He knew he couldn't stay. The county seat was 20 miles away, and the only man who could help him was Judge Miller, a man known for being as cold as a tombstone but as rigid as iron when it came to the letter of the law. If Silas could reach him, the Baroness was finished. But between Silas and the judge lay the great cypress swamp, a maze of black water, cottonmouth snakes, and men with hounds who would love nothing more than to hunt a man for sport. He stuffed the oilcloth package back into the false bottom of the bag and filled the rest with the rye grain to hide the shape of the documents. He grabbed a small piece of salt pork and his walking stick. He didn't have a weapon, only the truth, and in 1850s Louisiana, the truth was often a death sentence. As he slipped out the back of his cabin, the first howl of a hound echoed from the direction of the stables. They weren't waiting for morning. Eleanor wanted him gone now. He moved through the tall grass, his feet knowing the path even in the deepening gloom. He could hear Caleb shouting orders, the clink of bridles and the splashing of horses. They were heading for the main road, thinking he'd try to run for the city. Silas turned his back on the road and headed straight for the swamp. It was a suicide mission for most, but Silas had spent his youth hunting in those woods. He knew the places where the ground looked solid, but would swallow a horse whole. He knew how to walk in the water to hide his scent. As he reached the edge of the tree line, he looked back at the big house. It was lit up like a lantern, a monument to greed and murder. He felt the weight of the bag on his shoulder and the brass key in his pocket. The Baroness thought she had won when she burned his papers, but she had forgotten one thing. A man who has lost everything is the most dangerous kind of enemy. Silas stepped into the black water, the coldness seeping into his boots, and disappeared into the shadows just as the first torchlight flickered near his cabin. The hunt was on, and the prize wasn't just Silas's life. It was the truth that would destroy a dynasty. Eleanor stood in the center of Silas's empty cabin, the air thick with the smell of damp wood and the lingering scent of the rye grain. She didn't look like a grieving widow. She looked like a predator who had just realized the cage was empty. Her eyes scanned the dirt floor until they snagged on something small and dark. She knelt, her silk skirts dragging through the filth, and picked up a jagged scrap of leather and a few stray threads of heavy twine. Her breath hitched. She knew that leather. It was the same oil-treated hide her husband had used to bind his most private ledgers. In that moment, the cold realization hit her like a bucket of ice water. The bag of grain wasn't a final insult to a slave. It was a delivery system. And Silas wasn't just running for his life, he was carrying her death warrant in a moth-eaten sack. Notice this. Some people think silence is a sign of weakness, but sometimes it's just the time truth takes to set its trap. Outside, the plantation was a hive of chaotic motion. Torchlight flickered against the white pillars of the great house, casting long, distorted shadows that looked like grasping fingers. Eleanor stepped out onto the porch and screamed for Caleb. The overseer appeared from the darkness, his face flushed with the heat of the chase and the whiskey he'd been drinking to dull the humidity. She didn't offer him a reward this time. She issued a threat. She told him that if Silas reached the county line, Caleb would be the one swinging from the oak tree for the Baron's murder. It was a lie, of course, but Eleanor knew how to use fear like a whip. She told Caleb that Silas had stolen the Baron's secret stash of gold, hidden inside that bag of rye. She watched the greed light up in Caleb's eyes, a hungry fire that would drive him through the deepest parts of the swamp. 3 miles away, the swamp was breathing. Silas was chest-deep in stagnant water, the bag of grain held high above his head. Every muscle in his arms screamed for relief, but he couldn't lower the sack. If the rye got too wet, it would swell and burst the seams, revealing the oilcloth package to anyone who caught a glimpse of him. The water was black and slick with algae, and beneath the surface he could feel the slow, heavy movement of things that didn't want to be disturbed. A water moccasin slid past his shoulder, its white mouth a ghostly warning in the dark. Silas didn't flinch. He couldn't afford to. The hounds were closer now. Their baying was a jagged saw cutting through the humid night air. They weren't just tracking a man, they were hunting. Silas reached a small hummock of dry land, a tiny island of cypress knees and rotting leaves. He collapsed, gasping for air that felt like hot wool in his lungs. He reached into his pocket and felt the heavy brass key with the broken tooth. His fingers traced the cold metal, and he remembered the Baron's trembling voice. The Baron had known Eleanor was a bigamist. He had discovered it by accident, a letter from a lawyer in New Orleans that Eleanor hadn't burned thoroughly enough. But the Baron was already dying by then, the slow-acting poison already eating away at his heart. He couldn't go to the authorities himself. He was a prisoner in his own bed, watched by the woman who wanted him dead. So he had turned to the only person in the house who saw everything and said nothing: Silas. The problem was that Silas wasn't just a witness. He was a target. Eleanor had spent years building a reputation as a refined, grieving lady, but behind closed doors, she was a gambler who had bet the plantation's future on the turn of a card. She needed the Baron dead, and she needed the estate sold before her first husband, the real husband, showed up to claim his share. If Silas reached Judge Miller, the whole house of cards would come crashing down. Silas knew he couldn't just run. He had to outthink them. He opened the bag and pulled out the oilcloth package just to check the seal. As he unfolded the first layer, a small piece of paper fell out. It wasn't a legal document. It was a note, written in the Baron's cramped, dying hand. It was addressed to Caleb. If you can't stand a liar who uses power to crush the innocent, subscribe, and tell me, was that brass key in Silas's pocket a gift or a burden he shouldn't have to carry? Silas read the note by the faint, filtered moonlight. The Baron had written that he knew Caleb had been skimming off the cotton sales for years. He had the proof, the dates, and the amounts. But the note didn't say he was going to turn Caleb in. It said that the evidence was hidden in the same place as the proof of Eleanor's crimes. The Baron was playing them against each other from beyond the grave. He knew that if Caleb found out Eleanor was broke and that her marriage was a sham, the overseer would realize his promised reward was a fantasy. He also knew that if Caleb found the evidence of his own thefts, he'd have every reason to keep Silas alive, at least until he could destroy the papers. This was the turning point. Silas realized he wasn't just a runaway. He was a negotiator. But the swamp wasn't interested in negotiations. The mud was pulling at his boots, and the mosquitoes were drawing blood from his neck in thick, itchy swarms. He heard a splash to his left, not a hound and not a horse. A man. Caleb had left the dogs with the other riders and had circled around using a narrow hunter's path that Silas had forgotten. The overseer emerged from the shadows of a massive tupelo tree, a double-barreled shotgun leveled at Silas's chest. Caleb's face was a mask of sweat and malice. He didn't ask for the gold. He just told Silas to drop the bag and get on his knees. Silas didn't move. He held the bag tight. He told Caleb that there was no gold. He told him that the only thing in the bag was a rope for the Baroness's neck and a one-way ticket to the state prison for the man who had been stealing from the Baron's ledgers. Caleb hesitated. The barrel of the shotgun wavered for a fraction of a second. That was all Silas needed. He didn't run, he spoke. He told Caleb that the Baroness was already penniless, that the bank in New Orleans had already sent notice of foreclosure, and that she was planning to pin the Baron's murder on Caleb the moment Silas was dead. The silence that followed was heavier than the humidity. Caleb looked at the bag, then back at Silas. He was a brutal man, but he wasn't a stupid one. He knew Eleanor's temper, and he knew how quickly she turned on people when they were no longer useful. But then a new sound broke the standoff. It was the sharp, rhythmic gallop of a horse on the firmer ground at the edge of the swamp. It wasn't the search party. It was a carriage. Judge Miller's carriage was moving along the river road, headed for the neighboring estate. The judge was early. Silas saw the flicker of the carriage lamps through the trees. If he could reach that road, the game was over. But Caleb saw it too. The overseer's greed warred with his fear. If he let Silas go, he might lose everything. If he killed Silas, he might be killing his only leverage against the Baroness. In the distance, the Baroness's voice rose in a shrill, panicked command. She was coming into the swamp herself, led by a tracker who had found Silas's scent. She was desperate. She knew the judge was nearby, and she knew that every second Silas spent alive was a second she spent moving closer to the gallows. She didn't care about the rye anymore. She wanted blood. Silas looked at Caleb and saw the man's finger tighten on the trigger. The overseer wasn't convinced yet. He needed proof. Silas reached into the bag, his heart thundering, and pulled out the Baron's journal. He opened it to the page with Caleb's name on it and held it out. The weight of the truth was finally starting to tip the scales. Caleb took a step forward, his eyes fixed on the handwriting he recognized all too well. But as he reached for the book, a shot rang out from the trees. A ball of lead whistled past Silas's ear and barked into the trunk of a cypress tree. The Baroness had arrived, and she wasn't waiting for a trial. She had a pistol in her hand, and her face was distorted with a rage that looked like madness. She screamed at Caleb to fire, to kill the thief, to end it now. Subscribe. Here we pull up what they tried to bury. And tell me, do you think Caleb will stay loyal to a woman who has no money to pay him, or will he turn on her first? The swamp fell into a terrifying stillness, broken only by the sound of the Baroness's heavy breathing and the distant rhythmic clatter of the judge's carriage. Silas stood between two predators, holding the only things that could destroy them both. He realized then that the Baron hadn't just left him a bag of grain, he had left him a weapon. And as the Baroness raised her pistol for a second shot, Silas knew that the only way to survive was to make sure the truth came out before the lead did. The smoke from the Baroness's pistol hung in the damp air like a grey ghost, and the silence that followed was more terrifying than the shot itself. She didn't wait for the smoke to clear before she started screaming again, her voice cracking with a desperation that made the hounds whimper in the distance. She told Caleb to finish it. She told him that Silas was a demon, a thief who had stolen the very heart of the plantation's future. But Caleb wasn't looking at the Baroness anymore. He was looking at the page Silas had held out, the ledger that proved Caleb had been stealing, and the note that suggested the Baroness knew all about it and was planning to use him as a scapegoat. The air between them was electric, charged with the kind of tension that only breaks with blood. Reparaniso. A person who builds their house on lies always expects the walls to hold, but they never account for the foundation rotting beneath them. Eleanor took another step forward, the mud sucking at her expensive leather boots. Her silk dress was torn, stained with the black filth of the swamp, and her hair had come loose from its pins, hanging around her face like frayed rope. She looked less like a lady of the manor, and more like the gambler she truly was. Realizing she had pushed all her chips into the center of the table on a losing hand. She pointed the pistol at Caleb now, her hand shaking so hard the barrel traced circles in the dark. She told him that if he didn't shoot Silas and take that bag, She'd have him charged with the Baron's murder the moment they got back to the house. She claimed she had witnesses. She claimed she had letters hidden in the safe. It was a bluff, a desperate, frantic play, but in the dark of the Louisiana swamp, a bluff can be just as deadly as a bullet. Silas didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He just watched the way Caleb's eyes darted between the woman with the gun and the man with the truth. Caleb was a man who lived by the whip, but he wasn't a man who wanted to die for a woman who would discard him like a broken tool. Silas saw the moment the overseer's loyalty snapped. It wasn't a loud moment. It was just the slow lowering of the shotgun barrel. Caleb realized that if he killed Silas, he'd be the only one left for the Baroness to blame. He was a witness to her madness, and in her world witnesses didn't live long. But the swamp wasn't finished with Silas yet. As he tried to back away toward the sound of the carriage, his foot caught on a submerged cypress knee. He went down hard, the bag of grain slipping from his shoulder and splashing into the black water. The Baroness let out a shriek of triumph that sounded like a wounded bird. She lunged forward, her fingers clawing at the surface of the water, trying to grab the sack before it sank into the muck. Silas scrambled to his feet, his lungs burning, his heart hammering against his ribs like a drum. He grabbed the strap of the bag, just as Eleanor's hand closed around the other end. They struggled there in the knee-deep water, a former slave and a fake Baroness, fighting over a bag of rye that held the fate of an entire parish. Eleanor was surprisingly strong, fueled by the kind of adrenaline that only comes from the fear of the gallows. She scratched at Silas's face, her nails drawing blood, all while she screamed for the trackers to find them. Silas could hear the splashing of the other men now. They were close, maybe 5 minutes away. He knew that if they arrived while Eleanor was still holding that bag, the story would be rewritten before he could even take another breath. If you don't swallow the lies of the powerful, and you want to see the truth dragged into the light, subscribe. And tell me, does a woman like Eleanor ever think she's wrong? Or is she just mad that she finally got caught? Silas gave the bag a violent jerk, using his weight to pull Eleanor off balance. She stumbled, falling face first into the stagnant water. For a second, the swamp went silent as she submerged. Silas didn't wait to see her come up. He hoisted the heavy, wet bag and ran. He didn't care about the snakes or the mud anymore. He ran toward the light of the carriage lamps that were cutting through the trees like twin suns. He could hear Caleb behind him, but he didn't know if the overseer was chasing him or running for his own life. The brush tore at Silas's clothes and the thorns ripped his skin, but he didn't stop until he burst through the tree line and onto the river road. The carriage was there, a black silhouette against the rising moon. The horses flared their nostrils, startled by the ragged, mud-covered man who had just exploded out of the woods. The driver pulled hard on the reins, shouting a curse that was lost in the wind. Silas didn't wait for an invitation. He threw himself toward the carriage door, the bag of grain held out like a shield. The door opened, and there sat Judge Miller. He was a man who looked like he was carved out of granite. White hair, a sharp nose, and eyes that had seen every kind of evil a man could do to his neighbor. He held a heavy travel desk on his lap, the very one Silas had seen him use at the plantation months ago. The judge didn't look afraid. He looked annoyed, like a man interrupted during a serious thought. He asked Silas what business he had stopping a magistrate on the public road in the middle of the night. Before Silas could answer, the sound of crashing brush announced the arrival of the others. Eleanor emerged first, looking like a ghost from a nightmare. Her white skin was covered in black mud, her eyes were wide and wild, and she was gasping for air. She pointed at Silas and told the judge that the man was a murderer and a thief. She claimed he had killed the Baron and stolen the family's most precious heirlooms, hidden inside that bag of grain. Caleb and the other trackers gathered behind her, their torches casting a flickering orange light over the scene. The judge looked from the disheveled woman to the bleeding man in rags. He looked at the bag of grain, now dripping with swamp water and smelling of wet earth. He asked Eleanor why a man would kill a baron just for a sack of rye. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She said it wasn't just rye, it was a decoy. She said the baron had hidden his gold coins in the bottom of the sack to keep them safe from the bank. It was a clever lie. It explained why she was so desperate to get it back, and why Silas would risk the swamp to keep it. The judge turned his gaze to Silas. He didn't see a slave. He saw a man holding a bag that everyone seemed to want. He asked Silas if there was gold in the bag. Silas, his voice raspy and low, said there wasn't a single coin of gold in the sack. He said the only thing in the bag was the truth about who killed the Baron and who really owned the land they were standing on. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the brass key with the broken tooth. He held it out to the judge, the metal glinting in the torchlight. The judge's expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed. He looked at the key, then at the travel desk on his lap. That key was the only thing that could open the side compartment of his desk, a compartment where the Baron had once told him he would keep a duplicate set of records if anything ever happened to the originals. The Baroness saw the key and let out a strangled sound. She tried to lunge for it, but Caleb, sensing the wind had changed, put a heavy hand on her shoulder. The judge took the key. He didn't open the desk yet. Instead, he looked at the bag of grain. He told Silas to pour it out, right there on the road in the dirt. Eleanor started to protest, her voice rising to a frantic pitch, saying the grain was sacred or tainted, but the judge silenced her with a single, sharp gesture. Silas gripped the bottom of the bag. He felt the weight of the oilcloth package through the fabric. He knew that once the grain was spilled, there was no going back. Either he was going to be a free man, or he was going to be a dead one. He tipped the bag. The rye poured out in a golden stream, mounding up in the dust of the road. It looked like ordinary grain, and for a moment the trackers started to mutter, thinking they had been led on a fool's errand. But as the last of the rye fell, the shape of the false leather bottom became clear. Silas reached in and pulled out the black oilcloth package. He handed it to the judge. The Baroness was shaking now, her face pale, her lips moving in a silent prayer that no one was listening to. Subscribe. Here we pull the truth out of the shadows. And tell me, if you were the judge, would you trust the word of a lady in silk, or the evidence held by a man in rags? The judge took the package and carefully unwrapped the oilcloth. The first thing he saw was the marriage certificate from New Orleans. He read it in silence, the only sound being the heavy breathing of the horses and the distant call of an owl. As he turned the pages of the Baron's journal, his face grew darker with every line. He looked up at Eleanor, and for the first time there was something other than annoyance in his eyes. There was judgment. The trap the Baron had set from his deathbed was finally starting to close, and the Baroness realized that the bag of grain she had mocked was the very thing that was going to hang her. The Baroness Eleanor stood paralyzed as the silence of the Louisiana night was broken only by the sound of the judge's fingers turning the dry, yellowed pages of the Baron's journal. The torchlight from the trackers flickered across her face, revealing a mask of terror that no amount of expensive powder could hide. She had spent years perfecting the role of the grieving, virtuous wife, but in the span of 10 minutes on a dusty river road, her entire world had turned to ash. The judge didn't look at her. He didn't look at Caleb. He kept his eyes fixed on the documents that had been hidden in the bottom of a bag of rye, a bag she had laughed at, a bag she had treated like garbage. Repara niso. There is a specific kind of silence that happens when the truth finally catches up to a lie. It's not peaceful. It's the sound of a trap snapping shut. Judge Miller reached into the travel desk on his lap and pulled out a matching ledger, bound in the same dark leather as the journal Silas had carried. He took the brass key with the broken tooth from Silas's hand and slid it into the lock on the side of the desk. It turned with a heavy metallic click that echoed through the trees. The judge's face remained a stone wall as he compared the two sets of records. He found the duplicate marriage certificate. He found the Baron's private notes about the bitter taste of his nightly tonic. And he found the legal manumission papers for Silas, signed and witnessed months before the Baron's health began to fail. Eleanor tried to speak, but her voice was a thin, ragged ghost of itself. She claimed the documents were forgeries. She claimed Silas must have spent his nights in the library, learning to mimic the Baron's hand. She even tried to turn on Caleb, pointing a mud-stained finger at him and screaming that he had helped Silas steal the papers from the Baron's safe. But Caleb wasn't a fool. He saw the way the judge was looking at the Baroness. He saw the way the other trackers were slowly lowering their torches, realizing they weren't hunting a criminal. They were acting as muscle for a murderer. Caleb took a step back, his hands held open and away from his weapons. He knew when a ship was sinking, and he wasn't about to go down with Eleanor. But what Eleanor didn't know was that the Baron hadn't just relied on papers. He knew she might find a way to burn a journal or bribe a judge. He had left one more witness, someone Eleanor had overlooked because she considered her even less significant than Silas. As the judge ordered the group back toward the great house to formalize the arrest, a shadow emerged from the kitchen quarters. It was Hattie, the cook. She had been standing in the darkness of the back porch, watching the torchlight approach. When she saw the judge, she didn't wait for him to ask. She walked straight to the carriage and pulled a small blue vial from her apron pocket. If you believe that the truth has a way of rising to the surface no matter how deep it's buried, subscribe. And tell me, do you think the Baroness would have ever stopped if Silas hadn't risked his life in that swamp? Hattie placed the vial on the judge's desk. Her voice was steady, a low rumble that carried the weight of years of silent observation. She told the judge she had seen the Baroness emptying that vial into the Baron's glass every night for 3 months. She told him how Eleanor would wait by the door, watching the old man cough and gasp, never once offering him a drop of water. She had saved the vial, hiding it in a jar of flour in the pantry, waiting for the one person the Baron had told her to trust, Silas. The Baron had known that Hattie was too afraid to speak while Eleanor held the power, so he had orchestrated a plan that would remove that power in one swift stroke. The judge looked at the vial, then at the journal, and finally at Eleanor. He didn't need a jury. He had the confession of a dead man and the physical evidence of a crime that was as cold as the Baroness's heart. He ordered the trackers to seize Eleanor. She didn't go quietly. She screamed, she clawed, and she cursed Silas until her voice failed her. She was dragged into the very house she had killed to own, but this time she wasn't entering as the mistress. She was entering as a prisoner of the state. But the biggest revelation was still to come. As the judge read further into the legal documents, he found the certified marriage license from 1842. Eleanor's first husband, Julian Vane, wasn't just alive. He was a well-known merchant in New Orleans who had been looking for his runaway wife for over a decade. Eleanor had changed her name, moved to a different parish, and reinvented herself to trap the Baron. Because her marriage to the Baron was bigamous, it was legally void from the start. She had no right to his name, no right to his money, and certainly no right to the lives of the people who worked the land. The fallout was immediate and devastating. The state moved in to seize the plantation to satisfy the massive gambling debts Eleanor had racked up in the Baron's name. The noble widow was revealed as a fraud, a criminal whose greed had been her own undoing. Caleb, seeing the writing on the wall, tried to flee the parish that night, but the judge had already noted the entries in the Baron's ledger about his thefts. He was caught at the river crossing 2 days later, empty-handed and facing 10 years of hard labor. And then there was Silas. He stood in the middle of the foyer of the great house, the same room where Eleanor had burned his first set of freedom papers. The judge called him forward. In front of the remaining staff and the local authorities, Judge Miller read the Baron's true final will. Silas was granted his full legal freedom, effective immediately. But the Baron had gone further. He had known the state would seize the land, so he had hidden a significant sum of gold. Actual gold, not the imaginary coins Eleanor had chased, in a bank account in Silas's name in Ohio. It was enough to ensure that Silas would never have to work a day in his life unless he chose to. Silas didn't cheer. He didn't gloat. He just looked at the bag of grain that was still lying on the floor, the rye spilling out of the hole he had cut. He realized that the Baron had loved him in the only way a man of that time knew how, by giving him the tools to destroy his enemies and the means to start a new life. The grain wasn't just a decoy. It was a test. The Baron knew that if Silas was brave enough to keep that bag, he was brave enough to be free. As the sun began to rise over the Louisiana fields, the light hitting the white pillars of the house, Silas walked out the front door. He didn't take a carriage. He didn't take a horse. He just carried a small bundle of his own belongings and the heavy brass key which the judge had returned to him as a memento. He walked past the quarters, past the fields where he had broken his back for 40 years, and he didn't look back. The Baroness was in a cell, the overseer was in chains, and the inheritance of a simple bag of grain had turned out to be the most valuable treasure in the state. Subscribe. Here we don't let the stories of the forgotten stay in the mud. And tell me, do you think Silas ever forgave the Baron for making him play such a dangerous game for his freedom? The story of the Baron's bag of grain became a legend in that part of the country. People talked about the slave who outran the hounds and the judge who found the truth in a pile of rye. But the real lesson wasn't about the gold or the documents. It was about the fact that a lie can travel 1,000 miles and dress itself in silk, but it can never hide from a man who has nothing to lose and the patience to wait for the grain to be poured out. Eleanor died in prison 5 years later, penniless and forgotten, while Silas lived out his days in a small house by the lake, a man who finally owned his own name. The dirt always finds its way to the surface, and in the end, the only thing that lasts is the truth.